What a beautiful scene. Yeah? We definitely have a movement here. And I want to start by thanking the Marxist Group Sacramento that has already invited me here. It was a couple of years ago, I think. Yeah, maybe longer, yes. And DSA, and it's really a pleasure to be with you, particularly in this half time. So tonight, if you look at the flyer, you'll see that there is a broad spectrum of topics. And so what I'm going to do in the 60 minutes that I have is to give you very schematically an idea of the political perspective that I've been developing over the years, and also some of more recent work, and as it is also expressed in the books that you see on the table, and which I hope you read, because they will go much more in detail than what I can do tonight. Now, as you know, those of you who have followed my work, my perspective has been inspired really from a feminist experience. And when I mean feminist, I mean an experience that is really shaped by the history of struggle, of exploitation that women particularly have made in capitalism, in the history development of capitalism. And I look at women and proletarian women as expression of a larger population of people who have not usually, particularly in the Marxian socialist tradition, unfortunately, being recognized as being central to the process of social struggle, social change, and revolutionary transformation. And so for me, feminism has really been the discovery of a whole world, a world that, of course, many women of my generation and before me, the discovery of a world that we have lived, we have experienced, but at the same time, feminism gave us the words, and the struggle always excites your imagination and gives you the words, gives you an insight into what, in a way, you have already lived, but now you can begin to articulate because you gain the power in the struggle to have confidence in your own experience, in what you learn from the everyday. And that in particular has meant to discover the whole world of reproduction. I was coming to the movement from a leftist perspective, and from that perspective we immediately turned to Marx and so on to understand the particular specific forms of oppression, of exploitation that women have suffered in capitalist society. And like many other women, we were disappointed that in a way, our world, our experience was not represented there. At the same time, what we also found in Marx, we found in Marx the instruments, the insights that enabled us to criticize him, enabled us to go beyond the kind of analysis that you find, in Capital and many other works. Because in Marx we find not only an analysis of capitalist production, we also found an analysis of how a workforce is reproduced. How the capacity to work, which is also the base, the foundation for exploitation, how our capacity to work is reproduced. Right? Marx, over and over, let us understand that the capacity to work is not something that is given, it's not something that is natural, but it's something that has been continuously produced and reproduced because it is consumed during the work, in the process of exploitation. And this was in a way the spark that enabled us, many of us, to see that, yes, this is what we have been doing. This is what, in fact, used to be called housework, reproductive work. That this, in fact, is the reproduction not only of our everyday life, is the reproduction actually of our capacity to work and the reproduction of the workforce. Right? So in a way, the critique of Marx was also a road to the, a new understanding of what the reproduction of everyday life actually is, and with that, the opening up a whole new terrain of struggle. In the 70s, I was involved in an organization called the Campaign for Wages for Housework, right? Because out of that what we are called housework and reproduction is actually the reproduction of the workforce. And the fact it is not recognized is because in capitalist society, work has been identified with wage labor, and everything that falls outside of wage labor has not been considered as being essential to the accumulation of capital, right? Then we began to do an analysis of what is the wage, and what is the wage, and how capitalism has been able to govern, to perpetuate itself. And we realized that the wage is a very particular instrument. Marx recognizes that the wage is a means of accumulation, accumulating wealth, surplus labor, out of the working day of the wage worker. In other words, exploitation occurs because workers are working, producing much more than they receive in return for their work. Many of you are Marxists, so you know this very well. Right? But what we discovered by looking at the wage from the point of view of a population that was working without wages was that the wage has been an instrument also, right, to extract labor and exploit a much, much broader world. A much, much broader world. And it's been an instrument also to create hierarchies, to create inequality, not only to extract surplus labor, but also to divide the working class. And in that sense, the wage has been immediately a political instrument. Immediately a political instrument. And in the particular case of women, and then of course we made a connection also with race, the wage has been an instrument to delegate to men, to a particular sector of the working class. Has been a way of delegating to a sector of the working class the power to control, to supervise the work, right, of another sector. So that actually capitalism has never had to, dominate, control, exploit women directly. But it has done it indirectly, right, through the system of the wage relation, the wage and the lack of it, that has allowed it to delegate to men the power to supervise women, and also to punish women when they will not accomplish, when they will not perform, as according to the social expectation. So in fact, we did a whole analysis of domestic violence, starting from that inside, and realized that domestic violence could be so widespread because, in fact, it was institutionally tolerated. It was institutionally tolerated because it was understood that domestic violence was part of the discipline of domestic work. Right? In other words, it was very much part of the regulation of domestic work, the imposition of it, and so forth. Right? So that analysis for us was very fundamental, and we also saw the profound connection between sexism and racism, right? And the coloniality of capitalism, and saw that in fact one important element of the history of capitalist development had been not only at the continuous accumulation of wealth, but it had been the continuous creation of hierarchies, inequality. The production of inequality has been fundamental, right, to the perpetuation of the capitalist system, and certainly to this day, right? So that the ability to divide work, as in a way, of course, we see it. So that we understood that racism, sexism, coloniality, are structural elements of a capitalist society. And in fact, you find them all through the history of capitalism. And, but in the 70s, I think that today, most people in whatever section of the radical left will accept the reproductive work, is work that is essential to the reproduction of capital. In the 1970s, in the early 70s, when we began organizing, this was not the case. In fact, it was looked very often like a heresy. What are you talking about? And in fact, we used to have two types of objection. And one objection was, housework is really pre-capitalist form of labor, and it's nothing to do with capitalism, and in fact, as reproductive workers are really outside of capitalism. They are a pre-capitalist population engaged in a pre-capitalist form of work. And the other criticism was that, oh my God, you're seeing capitalism, in the only sphere of life, the family, sexuality, and child raising, the only sphere of life which is clean from capitalist relation, right? So that's how myself and other women, we began to go back to the history of capitalism to, in fact, show that what has been represented as a very natural activity, in fact, is a historical construction, that what we call housework and reproduction is nothing natural, but in fact it's a very, very specific, historically, socially, politically specific form of work. And, so for me, the task was, to go back to the origin of capitalist development. It's the work that eventually resulted in Caliban and the Witch. Go back and in fact show that the kind of reproductive work that we have in our society, certainly in the 20th, 21st century, had nothing to do, with a work that was timeless. That, for example, in feudal society, or in any society where people are producing, what they are producing is for their consumption, is for their subsistence. You don't have the division between production and reproduction, right? That in a feudal village, for example, right, the division between those who are producing and those who are reproducing. When you are doing agricultural work, and that work is work for the subsistence of the family, then you cannot have that separation. So this was the kind of work that I began to do to demonstrate that in fact there is an historicity, there is an historical determination to the kind of reproductive work. And I've been interested, in fact, in, through the years, in understanding, what has been the changes in the organization of reproduction as capitalist development itself changes under the impact of the struggle that people are making, which I really see as the fundamental motor, the engine of capitalist transformation. Capitalism does not change for an inner dynamic. It changes fundamentally because people are refusing, people are struggling against, are finding effective forms of resistance, and this is what is the cause of a major change in capitalist form of accumulation. So this is what led me to go through this long journey through basically the history of capitalism, and that led me to, in fact, verify what I was trying to verify, which is precisely the construction of housework, and on the path to it, also the phenomenon of the witch hunts that I see and as a fundamental moment, in the construction of a modern capitalist society, as a fundamental moment of what has been by Marx and others defined as originally primitive accumulation, right? This being the process that creates the condition of existence of a capitalist society. So to me, the question of the witch hunt has been really so fundamental, because in a way it made me understand that the developments that have taken place, the organization of women's life in the history of capitalism in the 17th, 18th century, and even much after, right, has been the product of a tremendous amount of violence, in the same way as the development of a racist society has had its foundation in the slave trade and the economy, the slave economy of the American and Caribbean plantation. And in fact, there is a deep connection between the two, because witch hunting was used not only to discipline women in Europe, but it was also used, for example, as an instrument to break the resistance of indigenous population, in the Americas. It was exported by the conquistadores, by the missionaries, particularly to places like Brazil, Colombia, the Andean region, right, where it was used more and more, particularly to instigate, construct new forms of misogyny and new forms of subordination of women. But it was also used, to attack indigenous population. And then, more and more, it was used to attack the protest of people in the slave plantation, and to accuse their resistance of being the expression of some diabolical instigation. So this work for me has been extremely important, because it's been an opening, like a window into what have been the material condition, the historical, political, material processes that have built a capitalist society. And in a way, I've never moved away from that kind of focus, because many of the processes that I studied, for example, in the 70s and 80s, leading to Caliban and the witch, I have then soon re-encountered them in the present. And one of the political experience, and not only of my experience, of the more recent year has been to realize that what Marx called primitive accumulation has never ended. That in fact is a continuously returning phenomenon. That every time the capitalist society is in crisis, every time is profoundly challenged by struggle, they actually resort to the same mechanism, to the same strategies that were implemented at its origin, to break the resistance of people to the new forms and new type of relation. And so primitive accumulation is in fact a continuously returning phenomenon, and by the late 80s and perhaps even earlier, it was already clear to me that what was taking place in many parts of the world, under the guise of globalization, neoliberal development, and in the case of many former colonial countries, structural adjustment program, that all of those developments, in a way, represented, moment, strategy, aspect, of a primitive accumulation process. Meaning what? Primitive accumulation, if it is the system, if it is the process that lays the foundation, creates the material, economic, political foundation, for the development of capitalism, has to be using, methods that create more and more on an expanded basis populations who have nothing. Populations are totally propertyless. This is what took place at the beginning in the 16th century when the peasantry was expelled from its lands, the land that they had in use in Europe. And this is what has been happening. In the 80s and 90s to these days, it's an ongoing process now, continuing. People are speaking of a permanent primitive accumulation, of massive dispossession that is taking place on a planetary scale. Dispossession by mining company, by oil company, but dispossession most of all by programs like structural adjustment, the programs implemented by the World Bank, by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that have plunged millions of people in abysmal poverty, clearly as a response, to the kind of protests that have taken place, throughout the 60s and after. A protest, a response to the anti-colonial struggle, as a way of recuperating the terrain that capitalism has lost, with those struggles. And so it's not an accident that by the 80s, you now have this new wave of expansion of capitalist relations, and that brings back forms of violence that one would have imagined, to have been confined to earlier period of history, For example, if you read Marx tells you, violence is an economic mean, is one of the fundamental economic means. But in the way Marx presented it, it would appear that only at the beginning of capitalist society, capitalism needs this excess of violence. Marx tells us that with time, a working class is generated that does not need any longer the whip, does not need any longer, a master class that enslaves them, cuts their hair, cuts their ears, and so forth. That in time, the effect of economic practices, for example, the need to work because you don't have any property, is sufficient, But as we have seen, this is not the case. Capitalism has needed, in fact, violence as a way to implement, a way of ensuring the expansion of its relation all throughout its history. Not only with the slave trade, but through colonization, 2 world wars. And now, we have seen for the last 2-3 decades, a world of dispossession, expropriation, privatization of wealth, and permanent warfare, and permanent primitive accumulation. So these have been very, very interesting for me, because my task in this scenario has been to see what happens to the question of reproduction. What happens to, and understanding that in fact the issue of reproduction is very fundamental, for in the capitalist class and the history of capitalism. Because one of the fundamental acts, one of the fundamental conditions for the existence and development of a capitalist society is this continuous ability that capitalism has to undermine, destroy the condition of reproduction for millions and millions of people across the world, deprive millions and millions of the possibility to reproduce themselves, whether it is by taking away their lands, whether it is by polluting their rivers, whether it is by precarizing work. And we find the process now, as one of the most fundamental characteristic structure of life for most people on the planet. So, starting from this perspective, which to me is extremely important because it means that we cannot really look forward or hope reasonably to the possibility of a capitalism with a human face. The idea of a capitalism that will be democratic, that will be able to provide prosperity for all, that will be able to actually ensure, to guarantee life for the majority of people of this planet. I think that now that is really a utopia that has no place. Because now there is an evidence, there is a record. We have 5 more centuries of capitalist development to look at. And what we are seeing is that at every turn, the prosperity that was guaranteed was only guaranteed for a very limited population. And it was guaranteed to a limited population, right, on the basis of the exploitation of the rest of the world. An intense form of exploitation and violence against the rest of the world. I think this is very important that we internalize and we take as the foundation of our politics. Because I think if we don't see that, then we continuously chase and adopt strategies that in the end, are going to be, disappointed. So, in some of the material that I have produced over the years, for example, Evolution at Point Zero, I have begun to analyze this development. Right? I began, in a sense, to look at, how has the restructuring of the world economy that has taken place, since the late 70s, when you have the beginning of what is called the neoliberal phase of capitalism, which is massive expansion of capitalist relations based on privatization of assets at all levels, all aspects of life. What happens to the reproductive work? What happens to, for example, the sexuality, procreation, child raising? This is some of the work that I have, been engaged in. And in that process, my own understanding of what is reproduction has changed, right? And has very much, widened. Because in the 70s, we looked at reproduction mostly as home-based. The home, the family, and housework. And more I'm beginning to understand that in fact the reproduction of the workforce and therefore the struggle over reproduction is a much broader process, because it's a struggle and it's a process that occurs, for instance, the subsistence agriculture. I lived in Africa for a few years, in Nigeria in the early 80s, exactly at the time when Nigeria and many other African countries were facing the so-called debt crisis. The debt crisis is a real fraud, massive fraud, organized by the Federal Reserve, because the debt crisis was totally engineered, right? Was engineered by a raise of the interest rate on the dollar, which overnight practically made all kinds of loans that countries that had just come out of colonialism, former colonial countries, had taken these loans in order to be able to develop, to catch up. Overnight, these countries became completely unable to manage their payments. And so you have the debt crisis. And the debt crisis was used, as you know, by the IMF, by International Capital, as an instrument to recolonize a good part of the world, to impose austerity programs, to impose reforms, right, that would bring back the same country to the position they were in during the colonial period, right? So that looking at that situation, it became very important for me to understand, that reproduction is also something much, much broader. That the kind of work that takes place in the home, it also includes the whole question of the environment, right? Because, for instance, in the name of paying the debt, more and more countries have been forced, right, to sell their forests, to sell whatever minerals they have, to allow oil companies to come in and destroy large, section of their lands. So that in fact the whole issue of the environment, the pollution of the environment, major issue of reproduction. And reproduction involves subsistence agriculture, another fundamental issue at the moment in which all through the world agriculture is being privatized and industrialized, right? And there is a tremendous struggle that is taking place now on this terrain, as of course on the terrain of the environment. So, in my work, this is what I've been, trying to analyze, and in particular, analyze from the point of view of the struggle that are taking place on all these terrains. And this is what the last 2-3 books that I've produced are concerned with. And what is in them is not only a reflection or the product of a reading, but is also the product actually of my contact with a lot of women in different countries who are involved in the struggles that I'm describing. And I want to talk a little bit about them. So that, for instance, in Re-enchanting the World, I'm looking at how have women and the population in general were being affected by this development. Expropriation, industrialization of agriculture, how have they responded, what kind of struggles have they been making. And one of the things that has been mostly inspired over the last year has been to see that, for instance, in many parts of Latin America and parts of Africa, in response to massive dispossession and forced urbanization, because when your forests are cut, when your rivers are polluted by mercury, when your fields are drying out because of the desertification, and you're forced to move to the cities, what over and over has begun to happen is the reconstruction by people, and particularly by women. Women have been really much the protagonists of this kind of reconstruction, of new forms of reproduction. Urban-based, people take over territory, take over land, often at the periphery of cities, and they construct roads through collective labor, they construct houses, and they organize new forms of collectivity, new forms of reproducing their everyday life. For instance, very common in many parts of Latin America, the popular kitchen, the comedores populares, the urban gardens, the places where youth can go and finding some forms of subsistence, and all of is a world of activities that is taking place, organized by people who have really, in a sense, had to decide whether to accept, being deprived of the possibility to live, or to put their energy together, to struggle together and create something new. And I think that this has been a very powerful existence, and I refer to it as the politics of the commons. The commons is a very old, archaic term. Takes us back to medieval England, at the time when the peasantry in the feudal estates, were basically negotiating with the landlords, in exchange for labor services. They would be given some land to use, to reproduce themselves, and they would also be given access to ponds, forests for fuel, grazing, meadows, etc. Those were called the commons. And as we know, those commons, produced a very strong collective life, like peasant assemblies. And much of the work that people did in those communities was organized on a collective basis. And in the case of women too, you didn't have individualized forms of reproduction, but you have much more collectively decision making. And I believe that the powerful struggles that you have in the 14th, 15th century peasant war, imagine the peasant facing, the nobility, which was a warrior class, a military class, facing them, that power of resistance came from the strong sociality that people had because of the collective labor. Well, there's something that is happening along the same line, I think, in many of the parts of the world, where, more and more as people have almost nothing to lose, who are now, in a hand, forced to create something new. They're forced to create something that, give us a taste, give us a feeling of what could be a different society. What could be a different society? I think it's not an accident that this is happening, above all in places like Latin America or Africa, where the tradition of the commons, of communitarian relation, common lands, collectively make decisions, is still being prevalent. I mean, even now in Mexico, for instance, you have many communal indigenous communities who are organized on a communal basis. They still have communal lands. It doesn't mean that those commons are perfectly egalitarian, etc., etc. But there is a communitarian spirit that I think acts out, is expressed also in the moments in which people are expelled from the rural area and then they go to the cities. And then, collective labor becomes the way to survival. So I've been very interested in that because I've come, of course, to the conclusion that particularly coming from a perspective, a feminist perspective, the two paths to struggle in a very broad way, from a feminist perspective, is one, right, to revalorize what capitalism has devalued, revalorize a whole world of activities and a whole world of spaces, relations, that in the history of capitalism has been systematically devalued. You know, in America Latina, you know, women feminists speak of placing life at the center, placing reproduction at the center, right? And in a way, this is the basic. What is capitalism? Right? Capitalism is a system, if you want to look at it essentially, that systematically subordinates human life, subordinates everything that is life-affirming, everything that has to do with the capacity to reproduce our life, subordinated, you know, to the accumulation of wealth, and it does that, of course, with the utmost of violence. And so that, you know, revalorizing, replacing life at the center is fundamental. At the same time, also the question of reorganizing the reproduction of our life, reorganizing the reproduction of the other life, not only in terms of thinking of different forms of production, different forms and relation of production that are not destructive of our life, but also different forms of reproduction, right, that go beyond the division that capitalism has built, right, that are much more collective, where we have the possibility of collective decision-making, yeah? Okay, oh, so right, so I'm going to finish very soon. Oh my God, I don't understand. I'm just beginning. Let me see. Okay, 5 minutes and I'll conclude. Yes, so the question of obviously the commons, that to me the concept of the commons become very important, very inspirational in terms of some understanding of what is a future society. And to me represents the idea of a society in which, first of all, everybody has access to the means of their own reproduction, but also a society where, based on cooperation and non-competition, but also a society based on self-government. And I have to say I'm very anti-statist. I really do not like the state. Because it seems to me that look through the history of the development of capitalism, the state is always violent. The state is always violent. And particularly with the kind of division that capitalism has organized. Now, with the depth of the division that it has organized, any conception of the state today would be really the domination of one sector of the working class or another sector, even the idea of a proletarian state. I'm really being a bit worried about the notion of a proletarian state. I'm much more interested in the idea of working around a society where we, at all points, organize form of self-violence, where people can decide directly over the condition of their life. How this is done? Because you can make decisions in a way only about what you know. You cannot make decisions about the world, so you have to make decisions about realities and conditions that you know, that you're familiar with, and that poses, of course, the famous questions of scale. But nevertheless, these are issues that can be resolved, and we have a long history to learn from, and from which we can also understand what is that we need to build, what is that is in the range of possibilities today. And also to conclude, it seems very important to me that in whatever struggle we make today, the elements of the future society, elements of the society that I've described have to be present. Whatever the struggle is, it seems to me very crucial, to break with the long tradition of postponing and postponing liberation and experiencing of different kind of life, different kind of society, postponing it continuously to the future. That we have to break with that transition, and as much as possible, in whatever struggle we make that struggle also the moment for the transformation of our everyday life. And that, I think, is something that I've been working through in my last two books, like Beyond the Periphery on the Skin, and also Witchhunting and Women. And this is a theme that I think is very important, because we have to see that people's life is extremely difficult. Obviously, I'm saying something, it's almost banal to say, because it's so obvious, because the suffering, is so extensive. And in order to understand why not many people are now, in the street and joining the revolution and so on, is not only because of the divisions, but it's also because just going through a day for so many people is an achievement. And to add to the work of surviving a day, the work of making a struggle, in many cases seems something of an impossibility. Unless that struggle, unless they're going to a meeting, unless they're running also the risk of going to a demonstration, unless that is something that immediately transforms your life, gives you more hope, gives you more strength, gives you more relationship with people, gives you more joy of living. In the last book that I published, called Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, the last section is a very short article that it's entitled "In Praise of Joyful Militants." In praise of joyful militants is it's a perspective that does not deny that in struggling you run risk and that you can pay high prices, but it says that if you do political work, it has to be joyful. That sad militance is no proposition. That and I know because I've gone through it. And the kind of militance where when you have to go another meeting, or another this, another that. And I think we need to go beyond that. And we have to understand that when making a struggle, and the work of making a struggle looks like alienated labor, it's time to do something different. And to conclude, I was recently in New York, and with a group of women that I work with, we were hosting in a meeting like this a domestic worker from the Dominican Republic, and she's now a domestic worker in Spain, in Madrid, right? And she's talking from the point of view of migrant women who have, imagine the kind of struggle, black migrant women not being citizens in Madrid and being black and etc. and so on. So then, and over and over, she was telling us how important it was and how they made it a rule. That when they have a meeting, for example, at the end, they sing a song, they dance, they do a dinner together, and they put joy in that, because it's the idea of reclaiming our body, reclaiming our life, has to be through and through also in the struggle. Thank you very much.
So I'm just just going to turn this over to you, and you can just pick and choose. And like at 8:30, then we'll break, and then she'll be signing books.
Okay. Do you have any question, comment? Yes.
So you mentioned the commons as places that are common, and those can't be moved. Is it possible to have a commons in motion, in travel?
Sure. See, I think it's very important when we speak of commons, right? To speak of commons not as things, but to speak of them as relation. To me, the idea of the commons is the idea of a principal organization of society. It's not just, a garden, a collective garden. That's an expression of a commons. But the idea of the commons is a broader idea. It's the idea of a society that is run on the basis of a logic which is the opposite of the logic of the market. It's the opposite of the logic of the state, right? It's the logic that I was describing of self-government and so forth. So it's a general principle of organizing. It's a general principle of social relation among people. It's not a set of things. It's not a collective kitchen, as important as it is. The collective kitchen is a particular realization of it. But I think it's important to think of it of a broader, as a broader structure. Yeah. Yes?
You spoke to the need to bring joy into organizing.
Yes.
And what that brought up in me is just, in my experience as an organizing communities of color and indigenous communities and black communities versus in white communities, do you have any other pieces of wisdom in your own organizing in terms of overcoming whiteness and organizing?
Overcoming whiteness in organizing. Well, I think that the important thing, I think, my God, is overcoming racism in organizing, right? I think that any organization that organizes on the basis of exclusion, my God, is doomed, to be absolutely, it's not acceptable, right? So it seems to me that part of the work of an organization is to ensure that relations are such and projects and programs are such that undermine the divisions that are built within us. And if the program undermines those divisions, then necessarily you create spaces in which you come together. You come together, when you're white with women of color, etc., etc. And here, for example, I want to say something, because now there's a big struggle for abortion, right? And there's all this avalanche of legislation that is coming in, right? Attacking abortion, Alabama wanting to introduce the death penalty for doctors who perform abortion. Yesterday in the New York Times talking about what is happening now in Ohio, really like monstrous, right? So there's going to be already there is a big struggle to defend Roe and Wade. And I think it's very important in that struggle, and this is something I've been insisting over and over also in this last book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, that the struggle for abortion be connected also to a struggle for the right of women who want to be mothers. Because one of the problems, for instance, in the 70s of many of the struggle for abortion presented as choice, control of our body, is not, it's part of it. It's part of a control. Control of our body is also the possibility to have children if you want to have them. And this has been one terrain of division between, the white feminists and many black women who have always been denied the right to be married. From slavery to this day, the National Health Advocate have spoken about the criminalization of pregnancy for black women. They are being criminalized. The moment they become pregnant, there is a whole set of hurdles that they are encounter that we can talk about if we have time. right? So I think it's the issue of what is the problem, what is the project. Obviously I believe that, when you have power relation, unequal power relation, you also have to have degrees of autonomy. So, I don't, for instance, it was important for women to be autonomous, the feminist movement to be autonomous from the male left. And it's crucial, obviously, for black women to be autonomous from, white feminists, to have their own form of organization, to decide, because the experience is different. And I don't believe in a universal perspective, because capitalism has made it one of its business to divide people, so we come from different history, different trajectory. And the power to say you are, the working class united, yes, but unity is the future. We have to construct it, it's not given. And to pretend that it's given is really to give more power to those who already have more power. It's really a lie, and given is to reassert the power of those who have had traditionally more power. Yes?
When you talk about reproduction and its relationship and suppression by capital, it brings to mind the situation in various capitalist, formerly colonizing or currently colonizing countries. Specifically, I was thinking about Japan, and they refer to it as an aging crisis, but it's really more of a crisis or a conflict between capital and reproduction, where as life expectancies grow longer and birth rates decline, there are not enough young people to fill the workforce, and so the government of Japan is giving all these incentives, specifically for women to have kids, and many are just not taking it because they're not interested, or because there's pressure to pursue a masculine idea of a wage-based career.
So what is the question?
Do you see that happening do you expect it to happen in other countries as well?
Well, for instance, there is the aging population. I the example of Italy. In Italy, you have, I think it's an important question. There's been, in some country more, some country less, but there's been obviously a struggle of women, right, to reduce the number of births they have. For example, I see very clearly Jenny Brown. In fact, if you look at that book, which is on the table, called The Birth Strike, right? In that book, the author, Jenny Brown, claims that there is a birth strike. There is a silent strike, in the sense that a lot of women are saying, no, I don't want 5 children, I don't want 3 children. And the reduction of the birth rate, which then the aging population, right, has to do with the fact that women understand that particularly now under the condition to have a lot of children means a lot of dependence, a lot of work, a life of, not being able to have any life for yourself. Now the question is the response of government. Very few governments have made it easier for women to have children, for that matter, right? So there's been a whole, immigration has been the traditional supplement. But of course, in most cases, what has happened, immigrants have come and struggled not to be slaves, which is what is happening in the United States, in Italy. The anti-immigrant crusade that is going on now has to do with the fact that immigrants have struggled to vindicate more rights, to have some social rights, to be able to bring their family, to be able to have a life that is worth living. And so the anti-immigrant is not because they don't want immigration. Like, for example, in Europe, there is a big crisis in Germany, in Italy, because people are aging. Every year they're shutting down primary schools. Right? They are, in some villages, they are the priests are giving a premium. People have a baptism because there's no baptism, and they're out of a job. And so, but they want immigrants as slaves. Actually, this is what it is. Yes.
In your travels in Africa, did you find that the people had time to do anything cultural, or was it all political?
No, everywhere people do the culture, like in Africa, Latin America, or whatever, it's not different from any other place. That, culture is part of the resistance. Culture is part of the everyday life, the art, music, people who die, art, music. Under slavery, people had culture. People didn't come only as arms in the slave, They came with their ritual, with their culture, with their music, with their dance. And that's where the charges of diabolism came in. Even in the slave plantation, there was a very thriving culture, right? Which then was banned as being diabolical, right? But people dance, all the music and the dance, they can all come from. So that is happening now across the world. This is what gives you hope, like music, singing, right? I think that every good movement, I always think, it's a good movement if they have good songs. Because, the songs create a collective subject. They help you create a collective feeling, a collective subject, right? In the same way as the dancing. I also have a piece called In Place of Dancing, In Place of the Dancing Body, in one of these books, In Place of the Dancing Body. I think those are very important. Without them, we die. Yeah. You?
Well, culture, you're mentioning capitalism, struggle, you have not mentioned religion. I wondered if you had any thoughts about the collusion of the state, the capitalists, and religion.
Yes. What to say? Give me another year, we can go on and on and on. No, of course. Yes, and today, but it's very serious, because today what we have is part of the new witch hunts. They really come from, this evangelical Pentecostal sect, and people warn me, don't put a blanket and assume that they're all, no, but a large number of these evangelical sects financed by the right wing in the United States and other countries are now going across the world, spreading a capitalist, neoliberal, individualistic, Christianity that basically said Jesus wants you to be rich. Richness is good. If you're not rich, it's because there's something wrong with you, or because people in your community are conspiring against you. So it's really putting people against each other. And they're telling people in these many countries, think of yourself, think of your interests. Don't bother with what's happening in your community, think of your interests. This is the kind of religion that is now being spread. And it's very clearly, it's a political investment that is made by the right wing, and now is, basically going across the world. And so, absolutely, yeah.
And it's behind the anti-abortion.
The religion, the church has always been with the state. All through the history of capitalism, the church has been sometimes formally, openly, and sometimes informally. But the church has always been part of state power. I come from Italy. And let me tell you, I know, all through, not only from reading it in the book, but all through my life experience. The history of the Vatican has always been a history of complete, not even complicity, they are part of the power structure. It's not accomplices with the power structure. They are part of the power structure. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Yes, hi. So I was pulled into your work because of, obviously the witch hunts and all of that stuff. And I think that, to jump on what you were talking about, the state and religion, that I believe that transgender people are the witch hunt right now with the immigrants. right?
Mm-hmm.
And I
And
work
along with a lot of women, yes.
LGBT people. And I wanted to know, along your work, have you worked with trans politics or like queer politics, and what you think about it? If you have like any like ruminations about it, I'd love to hear what you have.
Well, I mean, you know, in the history, the history of capitalist development, the family relation, and so on, clearly heterosexuality has been very much part of the reproduction of the workforce. So the monogamous family, heterosexual, and so on. And so every form of diversity has always been penalized. And, you know, during the witch hunts, for instance, very often gay people were burned on the stake, you know, before, after, you know, witches. And I think I mentioned in Caliban and the Witch that, you know, for instance, the derogatory words that you have in English for gay people, like fag, in England, you know, comes from the stakes. In Italian, finocchio, fennel, you know, is what they used because it's very aromatic, and they used to spread these vegetables on the stake to cut the smell of the burning flesh, right? So, and that is continuous, not in forms so openly violent, right? But for example, yeah, the obligation to be either male or female, right? So that all the intersex people have been mutilated, horribly mutilated in many cases, you know. So that, and I think it would be very interesting to see a world, what a world will be, in which we'll have a whole spread of genders. Right? And this will be a very, very interesting world. Yeah. That there.
So going back to what you were saying about culture and its inherently sort of revolutionary resistant qualities, it occurs to me that there's a counterpart to that on the side of counter-revolution in the form of the culture industry.
Oh, yes.
What would you say we could do to take back culture from that kind of homogenous monoculture that's being fed to us?
Yeah, I should have said, yeah, culture that comes out, you know, the real funk, it's culture that comes out from the struggle. It's culture that comes out from a collective experience of suffering and struggle. That I think, yes, the culture of the, you know, the industry is part of the, you know, the great rape, you know, that capitalism always uses, tries to use everything, also take your struggle and turn it against you. And that is really one of the great dangers that we find today. I mean, let's face it, capitalism is totally parasitic on people's imagination, people's creativity. They haven't created anything, right? As people have created the wealth and the technology and the inventions. And parasitic also on the earth. You know, they've robbed and squeezed and destroyed and polluted and appropriated the full hands, you know, and so they, you know, present itself as, you know, so innovative, but actually it's been completely dependent. And this is what is happening with the industrialization of culture. So, yeah, it's a struggle. Culture, like language, you cannot even develop a new term that is immediate. Think of what happened to democracy or the commons. I go to this university, you know, many are, you know, very, very expensive. And then you go and the library is called the commons, or the cafeteria is called the commons, but then your plate is $10. What is the commons? You speak of the commons, right? But so, and then people say, oh, don't use the commons because then I say, well, then we are reduced to silence. We have to use this category. It's like women. Like women is a battleground. Because to define what it means to be a woman, there's not one definition of what it means to be a woman. It's not a category that is static, frozen. So there are many ways, and it's a battleground. You know, for example, what my mother conceived as being a woman is not what I conceive as being a woman. There's been a big battle to change what it means. In the same way there has been a big change to decide what it means to be gay etc. So this language is also a ground of struggle and a ground of transformation. We have to be able to see that these concepts are not static, but they are moving, and they are contested. Yes?
Do you have a spiritual practice?
Well, yes, when I walk into a forest, or when I walk into the park, or when I look at the cloud, or I get up in the morning and I see this beautiful sky full of red like this morning in San Francisco for a brief moment. Yes, that's my spirituality. Or with people. Yeah, I think that people are a great wealth. And my relation with people, I think, are very spiritual often. Yeah. Yes.
You co-wrote an article about the Yugoslavia war in the 90s, and I was just wondering if you can elaborate a bit more and go into that aspect of your life. I really like the term you used there was in humanitarian interventions.
Yeah.
I know that term humanitarian intervention is being used a lot right now to justify wars and stuff. So I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more into your thoughts on those subjects.
Yeah, very interesting that you mentioned that article. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, on whom the bombs are falling.
Right.
That was the title of the article. When the attack on Yugoslavia, that was organized by Germany and in complicity with the United States, right, happened. I mean, this was very, very, very painful, and it was a tremendous, and so actually in New York, a number of us, a group of people came together, and we began to do some work in understanding, analyzing what was taking place, etc. And clearly, right, the whole issue of using human rights as a tool for, imperial expansion, very, very strong. All over the world. So, and this is an issue now. This is an issue that is really, really important. Because one, the use of human rights in that way to justify, right, intervening in a military way. So the colonialism, imperialism are now masked in that way. And then the other issue that is also important, that is posing a real political question. For example, in this book, which is Witchhunting and Women, I speak of the witch hunts that are taking place now in Africa and India in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, hand in hand with the IMF, the World Bank, and the Pentecostal, have begun new forms of witch hunts, right? In other words, in many communities in different African countries or India, you have women accused of witchcraft, and in many cases killed and brutally. So the work that I do, the analysis that I do, and I'm not alone, really connected to the expansion, the attack on the commons, land privatization, the complicity of local chiefs, often with foreign companies that are coming in and they want to displace community because they have to do mining, then they accuse the women of witchcraft, etc., etc. So there's a lot of that. But one issue that is coming up is how then this can be used. How can this can be used? This kind of analysis can then be manipulated. And I something very, very specific. I was recently at a meeting with some women from Africa, and they were saying that now in England, when there are women from Africa arriving at the immigration, often they are asked, right now they are asked if they have been subject to genital mutilation. If they say yes, they do not offer them some sort of help or anything, but that admission is then used against them to deny them residence or to deny them certain rights, because they are now treated as accomplices.
Wow.
Yes, they are treated as accomplices of the practice. Yeah, this is what they were saying. And so they were talking about how we are going to denounce things that have been done against us in a way that then is not used to turn victims into accomplices, right? So this is a whole issue, but it's very, very important. That goes along with the manipulation, appropriation of forms of struggle, of wordings, etc., etc. Right? This is, but I have to say that today, though, the issue of human rights even is not even used. Today it's just imperial power. The Trump don't even need the excuse of human rights. No, now is another step again. No, a lot of even the masks, the democratic masks have been dropped. They said, yeah. One more question. Oh, okay. What if I just listen to what people say and then give one answer? Right. So maybe like very quickly go along. Yeah.
A society that was anti-statist and saw the overthrow of the patriarchy.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Yes?
What do you think we can do to build structures for handling abuse towards women and children without turning to the prison industrial complex?
Oh, okay. Yes.
Do you see any relationship with money that could be like more good than evil of the wages you described? Is there an opposite relationship with money?
And the last one. Yeah.
You talk about refusing to put off our liberation and the need for militants not to be sad, for it to be joyful. I feel like we could learn a lot from rebellious Italians about this. There seems to be a long conversation about this. Can you say anything more about that?
Okay. Yes.
What would you say is the role of intuition in organizing?
Intuition? Wow, that's too profound. They'll go along with like the 2 seconds that I have to respond. Of course, because they always talk about women's intuition. Intuition is actually the result of a long process of knowledge. It's the result of a long process. In terms of Rojava, in the 80s, I didn't know about Rojava. I didn't know about Rojava in the 90s. I'm sorry, I was ignorant, but Rojava is something more recent years. And of course, but the struggle of, it's been always very important. The struggle is obviously very, very crucial, particularly now. We obviously have to give our solidarity to it. The question of money, no, I don't see. But money, let's specify. Money existed before capitalism, right? People used shells as money. People use all kinds of forms as a sort of money. But I think that money in a capitalist begins to function capitalistically when you have a society of people that don't have any means of subsistence. Then money becomes a means of exploitation, right? So money as a means of exchange and so on, but that exchange becomes exploitative when people are under the compulsion, right, of misery, of systematic immiseration. So that's a very important. The question of, jails, the demanding for more severe penalty is useless, not only useless, but you're asking in a way the institution who are responsible for the misery and so on. So the alternative, for example, change in the economic conditions of women. Yeah? For example, waitresses today don't still have any access to a wage. They don't have any means of supporting themselves. A woman told me, I think it was here, that, you know, when she comes to the end of the month so as to pay the rent, she wears something that is really very, with a big cut, and the tips are going up. Yeah? Depending on what she wears, she can tell what kind of tips, and to the end of the month. So capitalism is forcing you into relationships that are dangerous, that are violent, that are demeaning, etc., because they don't give you the means to support yourself. So that kind of autonomy is the road to go, not asking for more police. Yes. And, well, I don't know if in Italy there's much joie de vivre today. I don't know, there is a lot of, actually, ebullience in the... But there's a new movement. I don't know if you heard of it, but in the last few months in Italy, a movement that calls itself the movement of the sardines. The sardines is a metaphor because, you know, when you are very, very, you know, next to each other in a street, and some of the images that have come from the squares of Italy in the last few weeks, you think there is Chile or they think there is Argentina, because you have really lots and lots and lots of people, only very tight. So they call themselves the movement of the sardines. Right? But I'm not sure that actually can now, you know, excel for a particular form of joyous militancy. I would probably not. I think Latin America comes first. Thank you very much.